Care. In our company, the Borden buff Jules Ryckebusch, the psychiatrist Eileen McNamara, the trial lawyer John Corrigan. "100 years ago this week, this was the headline: Murder Most Foul in the Fall River newspaper. It was a story that sent chills around the country and around the world. More famous than the Boston Strangler, more haunting than the Salem Witches, the axe murder of Lizzie Borden's parents is the Massachusetts crime that everybody's heard of in song or story. Though actually the dog will get it wrong, Lizzie was in fact judged at the trial to be not guilty, which has not inhibited the second guessing and won't inhibit us tonight. We begin with a sort of music video on the case, starting down on 2nd Street in Fall River, where the unpleasantness transpired. In the Borden household, that Thursday, August 4th, 1892, began with an unpleasant breakfast of leftover mutton stew. After the meal, in the space of just 2 to 3 hours, somebody hacked to death the patriarch, Andrew Borden, and his second wife, Abby. Daughter Lizzie, who with the maid was the only other person home at the time, had a lot of explaining to do.
Now, Lizzie was the only one that ever was accused of the crime. She was tried by jury, and the verdict was not guilty. Now, when I was growing up, that was the end of the story.
At the Fall River Historical Society, Florence Brigham, who was only 92, hasn't tired of sorting out the Lizzie Borden story, right down to the number of whacks that killed Mr. and Mrs. Borden. Contrary to the popular rhyme,
it wasn't 40 and 41. Mrs. Borden, maybe 12 blows to her. Mr. Borden, maybe it was 12 to 15 blows to him.
It was Lizzie who summoned the police to attend to her murdered father, whose body lay on a sofa in the parlor, and it was Lizzie who sent the police upstairs to the bedroom to check for her mother.
Mrs. Borden was killed between the bureau and the bed. There's the bureau and there's the bed. And there's Mrs. Borden dead on the floor. Very little blood, considering the hole in the head. That's a handless hatchet. That's no axe. And it looks pretty small to me to have done all that damage on Mrs. Borden and Mr. Borden. There was blood on it. It didn't seem to be human blood. Now, I asked the psychiatrist, do you think a woman with that little thing could have done it? He said, oh yes, with enough hatred built up over a period of years. If she did it, I think it was for the money. And I think she got it into her head that that stepmother was beginning to influence Mr.
Over at Bristol Community College, 400 Lizzie Borden scholars and buffs spent 3 days this week reliving the case. Rather than whodunit, the big mystery might be why so many people still care.
This is the Fall River Daily Globe. It's a replica of the day after the murders, August 5th, 1983. Basically anything that had to do with Lizzie, we could have sold anything at all. It wouldn't have made any difference. We sold 2 different T-shirts. The one I'm wearing, and we had another one. We sold out of that one within 2 days. That was gone. Who did it? You want my opinion of who did it? I always never believed that Lizzie did it. She had to have an accomplice.
After your father went out, you remained there either in the kitchen or dining room all the time?
The conference ended with a reenactment of the judicial inquest that preceded Lizzie Borden's trial and acquittal. It was her only recorded testimony on the mystery of the murders.
When you saw your father, where was he?
On the sofa,
What was his position?
lying down.
Describe anything else you noticed at that time.
I did not notice anything else. I was so frightened and horrified.
You saw his face covered with blood.
Yes, sir.
Did you see his eyeball hanging out?
No, sir.
See the gashes where his face was laid open?
No, sir.
Nothing of that kind.
No, sir.
is Miss Lizzie Borden's favorite hymn, At Home in My Own Country.
Lizzie Borden's inheritance helped her move to the mansion that she had dreamed of up the hill where Fall River's wealthy lived. She was liberated to lead a comfortable spinster's life, but she never acquired respectability, and she never rose above suspicion.
My troubles have been many, and my sorrows have been sore. This, in actuality, is Miss Lizzie's last message to the world, and that was why it was so important to find it.
We have three eminent Borden buffs with us tonight. I'd like to begin with Jules Ryckebusch. You're the buff, but the question for everybody is, who done it?
Well, most experts agree that Lizzie Borden did it. Nobody else has ever been found who had a motive to kill the stepmother and then hang around the house for an hour and a half and then kill the father. The father was a banker. He might have had enemies, but we know of nobody who could possibly have had a motive to kill the stepmother and the father, and no one else had access except the maid, Bridget Sullivan, and Lizzie. And if Bridget was that terribly upset with the household, she could have quit. Lizzie could not have resigned as daughter.
What do we presume was Lizzie's motive?
Many things built up to it, I think. First of all, there was the issue of money. She lived in a confined house with a father who gives the word stingy new meaning. He was worth at that time $500,000. I think by today's standards that'd be $3 or $4 million. They could have had gas light, they didn't. They could have had running water, they didn't. They could have had a bathroom, and they didn't. Lizzie's life was a very confined life. She also had a stepmother who could have walked out of a fairy tale. She was nasty, unpleasant, and Lizzie did not like her at all. Now, something might have sparked the killing, certainly. She may have planned to kill them, but I don't think that she planned to kill them that way. You don't plan to put 23 axe blows, and Mrs. Brigham, I think, is wrong on this one. You don't plan to put 23 axe blows into someone's head and then wait around and plan to put 11 axe blows into your father's head.
Eileen McNamara, you're a psychiatrist. You do trial work. Who do you think done it?
I think Lizzie clearly did it. She never acted like an innocent person would. She never seemed particularly upset that her father and her stepmother were killed. But I don't think that money alone is sufficient motive, because even though Mr. Borden was stingy, he spent lavishly on Lizzie. She was able to get from him what she wanted, including $5,000 just a few months before the murders, a trip to Europe, beautiful clothes, and a sealskin cape. And she would have come into her inheritance in due course, according to Massachusetts law. And the murders were savage. These were multiple axe blows to the head. So I don't think money alone accounts for it.
What does? And was there anything remotely in her past to suggest this kind of volcanic violence?
Her friends always, her best friends, her defenders, described her as sullen, socially maladroit, and obnoxiously reticent. And she was known as a kleptomaniac in the town, both before and after the murders. Store clerks would watch her and know to send her father the bills for collection.
John Corrigan, who done it?
I think Lizzie did it, but I don't rely necessarily on an analysis of her character so much as I do on an analysis of the evidence that was available and collected. And the critical fact for me is that she had no coherent explanation of where she was during the times when, by the medical evidence, that these murders took place. And the explanation she did purport to give at the inquest, shortly after the trial, was riddled with contradictions and evasions and, I think, falsehoods.
Everybody knows the dog roll, but everybody forgets the fact that she got off. If she was so clearly guilty, clear to you, how do we explain that she didn't hang for it?
Well, first of all, and John can tell you this, the evidence that would have convicted her was kept out of the trial in what we might call an early Miranda decision. The mayor of Fall River told Lizzie Borden when she asked him, about five days after the crime, if anyone in the house was suspect. And he said, yes, you are, Miss Borden. Now, the act of that almost put her into a form of custody, and she should have had legal counsel at the inquest. She didn't. Her attorney, Andrew Jennings, and the head of her defense team, George Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts, saw to it that that testimony was not allowed at the trial. They also succeeded in keeping Eli Bentz's testimony out of the trial. He was the pharmacist who swore that she had tried to buy poison from him. That's important. And also, you had a mandatory death sentence. And the juries in that day and age were not about to hang a woman unless the evidence was phenomenally overwhelming.
Everything about this case has a certain old-fashioned Massachusetts class bias about it. The newspaper the next day, the same headline, the same paper that had Murder Most Foul suspected a Portuguese man for doing it. The Irish maid was easily suspect. Lizzie came from, as you say, a certain kind of quality and money. Her defense lawyer was a former governor of Massachusetts who had appointed the judge that oversaw the trial. So that there's a certain class fix about the whole case. Does that explain why she walked?
I don't think so, no. I think she walked because the jury honestly answered the question, can you find her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, negatively. I don't think the evidence the jury heard was sufficient to convict her beyond a reasonable doubt. Was the fix in, and is that why the key evidence was kept out? I would be very hesitant to say so. It's true.
Was there, in Nixonian language, a cover-up?
No, I don't think there was an organized cover-up in the sense in which the Nixonians would have used the phrase. There were 3 judges who tried the case. In those days, you had 3 on a capital case. One of them, as Jules pointed out, was appointed by Governor Robinson when he was governor. He was the chief defense counsel. That's the one that gave the charge to the jury, and the charge to the jury has been pretty fairly described as a direction to the jury to do everything they possibly could not to find her guilty. But, on the other hand, the case was well tried by both sides. The defense did a very good job of cross-examining key witnesses, cutting out the reliability on which their testimony stood by pointing out discrepancies and incompletions and so on. So it was
at the risk of getting just a little bit technical, explain why the inquest in the case was so much more damning against Lizzie Borden than the trial. How did that happen?
All right. The inquest is a separate proceeding from the trial, and it was held within 5 days of the murders. It was held on the 9th, 10th, and 11th of August, 1892. The murders were on the 4th. At the inquest, Lizzie was examined and told, as I say, these really convoluted and not believable tales. 9 months later, when the case came to be tried, the prosecution offered the inquest testimony. You couldn't compel her to testify at the trial. The Fifth Amendment prevents that. But you could offer a prior inconsistent statement she had made, or a prior admission of guilt that she had arguably made in the course of this inquest. The trial judges said, no, you can't put that in because she was effectively under arrest at the time she testified, and because the inquest is regarded as an inquisitorial and not adversarial proceeding, she was not allowed to be represented by counsel at the inquest, and for those reasons they kept it out.
Doesn't it sound to the rest of you as if she got the benefit of her class position in the case?
Many people think she got the benefit of her gender instead, and it's been described as a gender trial. Things were going against her when she acted cold, aloof, and flat. When she fainted at the trial and showed herself to be a true Victorian woman, public sentiment turned remarkably in her favor, and people were unwilling to think that a delicate, emotional, gentle Victorian lady, which is how she was portrayed, there's little evidence that's how she actually was, could possibly have committed these horrible murders. That's one of the reasons that she was also acquitted.
I'm very much a newcomer to this case that you all know intimately, but I like the theory of a man named Brown who believes that she was covering up for her father's bastard son, her half-brother, who was maybe crazy, who would have had a clear motive, and that she was doing the Victorian thing in covering up for somebody else. What's wrong with that notion?
Well, first of all, I don't think she'd want to cover up a case like that, knowing that she would hang, literally hang for it. There's no evidence that William Borden, which Arnold Brown becomes very enamored of and later refers to as Billy Borden, there's no evidence that the man ever existed. There was a William Borden born around the time. There's no birth certificate in any of Fall River's records that indicate that such a man existed. However, a fellow named Peterson, who came to the conference we had at Bristol, said that he had given the story to Arnold Brown, and that his twist was this, that Lizzie had hired the illegitimate half-brother to come in and kill them. But there's no evidence that any such man existed. Nobody saw him, and if she was covering up, she was apparently willing to cover up to the point where she would put her life on the line, and I find that unlikely. His book also suggests a phenomenal conspiracy between the prosecution, the defense, and the entire establishment. And he makes the class issue a very important one. The class issue is important. If the Portuguese guy had been charged, he would not have had the money to hire George Robinson, who, and I think your viewers will like to hear this, charged $25,000 at a time when a Superior Court justice salary was $5,000. I was able to talk at the conference to the grandsons of Andrew Jennings, the other defense attorney, and that $25,000 did not include his fee or Adams, the other attorney's fee. So George Robinson charged $25,000, and the check was in the mail pretty quickly.
But then again, that sounds like he was spreading it around to a wider conspiracy, shall we say, doesn't it?
No, that was his fee. It was a phenomenal fee, probably by modern standards, close to $500,000. She could afford it, and she did it. What I'm suggesting is that a Portuguese or a lower-class person, or somebody who didn't have her status, could never have hired George Robinson.
If Lizzie Borden had been a man, we would have forgotten him long ago, would we not?
Yeah, I've often said if Lizzie had been Lester Borden, maybe that's the case. If she had succeeded in poisoning them, we might not be sitting here talking about it right now. But this is a crime that reaches deep into our psychology. It's the type of crime that is almost out of a Greek tragedy. She murdered her father, slaughtered him, eliminated his face from the earth. She had a horrible stepmother, and she slaughtered her. So you've got a type of crime that committed by a woman, people at the time didn't think a woman could do this, that has worked its way into our folklore, into our mythology. It's a major American legend. It exists in song, opera, ballet. And so I think you're quite right. If it had been a man, we wouldn't be talking about it. And if it was poison, we probably wouldn't.
We've learned a lot about women and what they can do, and women's anger and women's suffering. In what sense is this a woman's story?
Well, it's interesting that the crimes occurred just when the women's movement was gathering a lot of momentum in the country. The suffragette movement, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was a group of women who wanted to tell men how to behave, and the thought of women's higher education. So Lizzie comes at that time as another possible role model for women, and a shocking and I think a rather frightening one to the culture at the time.
You know, Jules, you were saying that the doggerel, the famous doggerel that we all know, sprang up almost before the body was cold. That's a story in itself, it seems to me. Why, whoever the anonymous author of that verse was, why did the author, and then everybody who's known it ever since, see some big folk meaning in this story?
Well, I don't think anybody saw any big folk meaning in the little piece of doggerel. It plays on the irony of a phenomenal act treated very lightly. The little play on words. When she saw what she had done, she went out and gave her father 41, like this is a fun thing to do. The little piece of doggerel did spring up almost immediately, and interestingly enough, that lives in our oral tradition. You can go to a playground today in Kansas City, and you shouldn't be too surprised if a couple of 7-year-old girls skipping rope are singing that. And they're not giving any thought to its symbolic significance, and they're not giving any thought to Lizzie Borden. And they probably aren't thinking about the murder. It's just a cute little piece of doggerel with a twist of irony.
I think they're thinking about Lizzie Borden.
Well, they are now.
Took me to buy that house when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. Lizzie Borden's been a figure in my imagination all my life, I think.
Sure. It's the most famous house in America without a plaque on it.
She's America's version of the Electra myth.
I was searching my feeble memory for Greek myths. Explain that.
I can't.
The Electra myth is the obverse of the Oedipus myth. It's the Oedipus was the son who fell in love with and married his mother, which is then thought by psychiatrists to be a paradigm for a certain kind of natural attraction that every son has for every mother, and the father is perceived as a figure who gets in the way of that. Well, this is a little bit the reverse of that. Electra, the daughter who falls in love with the father. Lizzie in love with Andrew Borden, Abby Borden getting in the way. And what Lizzie did that's different from all of the little girls in the history of the world is that she actually took active steps to get the stepmother out of the way. And she did so if she did it other than in a calculating way with a rage that was really, as you said earlier, volcanic. It was extraordinary. What's interesting to me is that she then went on to kill the father too, which seems to take it out of the Electra myth and put it in some higher category of special, awful crime. And that's, I think, what the fascination of it is, that in all of us there is some impulse. If mother cuts off the Jell-O, or father won't take you to the ball game. When you're 5 years old, maybe you want to kill him for that. Most of us keep that under control, and apparently Lizzie didn't.
But the other part is that from the beginning, including the doggerel writer, people thought there was something funny here, including from the New Faces of 1952 that gave that song.
But humor always expresses the forbidden. That's our avenue to let out the emotions that we're not able to let out in any other socially acceptable way. That's what most humor is.
You go to an operating room in a major hospital where they're doing the most delicate brain surgery or open heart surgery. You'll find the level of coarseness in the jokes is appalling. And the stranger to that thinks that, gee, this is terrible that these dedicated medical professionals would be making these coarse and awful jokes and laughing.
Take a walk in our newsroom, John.
I have, Chris, and you're right. But the point of it is, that is really the only way that they can safely discharge all this tension that the event itself creates for them. And that's, I think, what Eileen is saying, is why doggerel and jokes, and we kidded about it, but there weren't really any little rubber hatchets being sold in Fall River this week. But that kind of thing is for that purpose.
Is this remembered in Fall River partly because nothing else has happened in Fall River in the last 100 years?
No, it's not. Not for that reason alone. I don't think so.
Do people in Fall River see it differently than the rest of the world?
I of the three of us, am the only one born and brought up in Fall River, and for me it was really a horizon against which our lives as children and later adults took place. It wasn't regarded by us as a terribly shameful thing that had happened in the city, although I think it was among the social class that the Bordens belonged to, who were the wealthy mill owners and their collateral relatives. But to us it was just a thing that had happened, and it was interesting, and it was to some extent intriguing because it was technically unsolved. No one was ever convicted of the crime. But it was not a particularly shameful or horrifying event in that sense that the city would hide it or just not talk about it.
She was either the most innocent of victims because her life afterwards was one of solitude. She was shunned by society, and she was shunned by the class that she belonged to. So she was either innocent and persecuted throughout her life, or she was guilty and got away with double murder and inherited a fortune that she lived on comfortably the rest of her life. And nobody knows the answer.
It's almost, it's like the Who Killed JFK case in the sense that it's hard to believe how Jack Ruby went to his death without giving or somebody getting from him a sort of, no kidding, Jack, what happened story. And it's hard to believe that Lizzie Borden lived up there on the hill all those years and nobody said, Lizzie, before it's too late.
This is the verse she had sung at her funeral. The green leaf of liberty is beginning to fail. The bonny white rose, it is withering and all. I'll water it with the blood of usurping tyranny, and green it will grow in my own country. That's what she chose to have sung at her funeral, a story about ending tyranny with blood. I actually think that is her public statement about her guilt.
Translate it a little bit. It's not quite clear to me.
Sorry. She talks about the green leaf and the white rose, which could be her sister and herself, withering, and reviving them by watering them with the blood of tyranny. And it's from a Scottish poem. And that to me sounds like her statement, my sister and I had a difficult life, we killed our fathers, and now we are happy. At any rate, this unusual and obscure Scottish verse is what she asked to be sung at her funeral.
There was not a large funeral. It was sung in the house, apparently to an empty house, except for the funeral man. And the verse itself had been sculpted into the mantle of the fireplace in the living room. So it's a significant song to her. It's not just a casual gesture.
She took her place among the upper class of Fall River at the time. Did she ever dish the dirt with anybody?
She led a very odd life, a very unusual life. She flaunted the wealth she inherited, and she continued to live in Fall River. She could have gone anywhere. She had enough money to live on, certainly. She managed to accumulate the things that she had been denied. While Eileen points out that her father did give her a few things, she still lived in a horrible house. She bought a large home, not quite a mansion, but a big home. She managed to put a very fancy central heating system into it. She bought a fancy electric car and had a chauffeur, later on a big black Packard. And she flaunted her wealth around town. It'd be nice to see how the average Fall Riverite looked at her when she went by. And little kids would run through her yard singing the little dog roll.
We're going to come back to this in another 100 years. Thank you, Jules Ryckebusch, Eileen McNamara, John Corrigan. Next week, we're repeating a special broadcast on the gospel music of Dennis Montgomery III. And 2 weeks from tonight, to close the Republican convention in Houston, we will have a conversation with the stubbornest and maybe the most sympathetic reporter on the George Bush case, the author of What It Takes, Richard Ben Kramer. I'm Christopher Lyden. Good night.